Hello and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Vanessa.
Vanessa, hello. So this episode is a little different than what we normally get. This is a very conceptual episode where it's all kind of in one location. So I wanted to ask you, do you have any favorite episodes of TV that are a bit different than their normal format? Anything that changes the concept of the show for one episode?
I do. So the first thing that comes to mind with this idea of changing the concept is an episode of House called 9 to 5, where it usually follows, House and his team. But this episode follows a normal day in Cuddy's life, who is House's girlfriend eventually and whatnot. And she's the hospital administrator. So it follows a normal day in her life, kind of having to clean up after all of these messes that House makes and all of this stuff. So I thought that it was so interesting how they did it, because there were scenes where she's walking away and the elevator doors are closing and you hear snippets of things that are happening with House and his team, but you don't get the full experience because you're following Cuddy. So it was a very interesting episode.
Yes, that is one of my favorite House episodes. I love that one so much. I love anything that's kind of like that, when you're exploring a different character's life, when they have enough juice in them to carry an episode on their own. That's a really good pick. I would say that one of my favorite episodes of this kind is actually the episode Fly from Breaking Bad, where it is all Jesse and Walter in the meth super lab for the entire episode, and it's basically just a play of them talking to each other while hunting down this fly. This is a bit of a controversial opinion. I know people think that this is the worst episode of Breaking Bad because it's very fillery and it doesn't have a lot of hardcore plot going on. But as someone who just likes watching this it's a play, a character study of these two people at a very desperate point in their lives, 10 out of 10. That is maybe my favorite episode of Breaking Bad outside of the giant plot episodes where you're oh my god.
Yeah, that's a really good episode. I do enjoy that episode. I put that on a lot when I want to be left alone because nobody else wants to watch it.
That's really funny. I feel you with that. So, anyway, in this episode, OR, the camp is hit with a seemingly endless amount of wounded. So we spend the entirety of the show in surgery. We see the challenges that arise and the emotional toll this takes on the doctors. Vanessa, what did you think of this episode?
So I basically can't say anything bad about this episode. It was so good. We were talking about this before we started recording, but this was the first real banger, I feel, of season 3 so far. Rainbow Bridge was good, but this just takes the cake. I love this episode. I loved that it didn't have a laugh track too. Tonally shifted the entire show. Was so good.
Yes, we've talked about this in the past, that the producers of the show and the network were kind of at odds at some points of they didn't want to have a laugh track, but the network wanted to have a laugh track because that's just the standard thing that you do with sitcoms. So they made a compromise that they wouldn't have a laugh track in any OR scene. And this feels like a real called shot at the network of hey, we're gonna have the entirety of the show in OR, so no laugh track today, buddy. Really, that is the concept of this one, where they're what if we did an episode entirely the drama? And it's so good. I really love this one. And I actually think that the past episodes that we've had that were extremely goofy and weird, like last week with the dead body, charting him around, makes this episode so much better because you really get the amount of flexibility the show has to do the extremely goofy things. And then literally the next week, they let them do this really well done kind of half hour of drama television with very few jokes.
Yeah, I agree. This is I don't know. I don't even know what I want to say about this episode. It was just so good. It was just kind of peak MASH to me. I think that having no laugh track just made this so much better. They obviously weren't trying so hard for the comedy in this episode because that's just not what this episode was about. But I do wonder how different the comedy would really hit, because I've never seen the episodes without the laugh track. I know that you've watched a couple of them without the laugh track, but just like thinking about it, how tonally different this show would be without the laugh track, and like the way that the creators wanted it to be is so interesting to me after having watched this show so many times over.
Yeah. It is a very different experience to watch the show without the laugh track in the episodes where there is one. But as a DVD bonus feature, you can watch the episodes without the laugh track. And I've done that a few times, like you said. I was just explaining that to people who may not know. But this one, you really do get that pure, what they intended the show to be from their pitch if they didn't have the network wanting them to have a laugh track. And you can really tell that the tone is very different, because there are still jokes. Like, it's basically the same kind of jokes that Hawkeye and Trapper tend to make in these scenarios, but the fact that there isn't an audience laughing, it's a lot drier and a lot more like, oh yeah, that's like funny, rather than like, oh, time to laugh now.
Yeah.
Obviously, this episode's designed around not having a laugh track, and the other ones are designed around having a laugh track, so it's not necessarily a one-to-one comparison, but this is a real pure MASH episode, like you said. This is kind of like MASH defined. There's going to be hard competition for the rest of the season for me when we do our what episodes would you recommend people to watch if they want to get to know MASH. This would be top of the list for me.
Yeah, I hard agree with you on that one. So I think that we should get into why this episode was so good. Right off the bat, you could tell this episode was going to be different from just the prep before going into the OR. Even though it had like some funny things in it, like Trapper with his sunglasses, I laughed when I saw him, and Hawkeye flirting with a nurse and stuff like that. But I thought it was also an amazing shot of Hawkeye scrubbing up before surgery. That was really cool to me because it was almost foreshadowing what was going to happen.
I agree with you that seeing Trapper in his sunglasses being hungover from the night before was delightful. Every time they put Trapper in sunglasses, I'm like, oh man, just something about Wayne Rogers' like actual look with sunglasses on. You're like, oh, that's the coolest dude. I want to be him. And you're right. I really liked this scrubbing up and how it started, because obviously this episode is very different than the norm. But having it start this way with, you know, your usual boys being boys kind of shenanigans really establishes that, like, yes, this one is a little different than what we're used to, but it's also entirely normal for them. This is just another day. It's not special. They're just like, yeah, we're going to work. And also, Trapper's hungover from the night before. And like, that's pretty normal.
I thought it was also interesting because, you know, we get this pre-OR scene and Henry is talking to Radar, and Radar is kind of parroting back what he's saying before he says it, you know, his typical Radar thing. And then when we're in the OR scene too, we have Klinger in like his traditional nurse's outfit with the red cape, which was very funny. But Henry was like, hey, take that dress off. And it almost to me in this first couple of minutes felt like one of those, hey, we're reintroducing the shenanigans of this like silly MASH unit. But then it just completely like kind of took a turn into a way that is so different than all the other episodes. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm going to say something that you might not agree with at all. But this episode, I feel like in another universe, if the show did not go on for 11 seasons, this would be an excellent series finale.
Oh, for sure. I completely agree.
Okay, good. Because I really thought about that as this was going on, because everyone felt so in character, but the stakes were like so high. It was a really great representation of, I think, what the show tries to set out to do on like its good days, of like really dressing down the war and showing like how difficult it is for these army doctors in it, that even the conversations that the characters have in between surgery scenes, which we'll get into, felt like really final moments for them. It's kind of weird that this was so early in the season because like it establishes thing about Henry and Frank that kind of changed their character a lot. And if this was like the last time we ever saw them, it'd be a really good like note to end on for basically the entire show. I think it wraps up all of the characters really well, and it's kind of odd this is episode 4.
I agree with you. Like, I am pretty surprised that this was just kind of stuck in the middle of the beginning of the season like this. Like, it does feel like it should be the beginning or the ending, you know what I mean? More so the ending with what you described with Frank and Henry, but yeah, I don't know. Like, that always like kind of adds to my enjoyment, where it's just like, hey, remember that these characters are, you know, kooky and crazy, and also these little insights into their characters as well that we don't get previously. I don't know. It always makes for a very good episode, in my opinion.
Yeah. So this first OR scene is very like standard for what we normally see in the OR, with them razzing Frank, all these kind of little shenanigans, just kind of keeping it light as things go on, with a few like notes of drama with a wounded guy from Ethiopia, and he says something in his native language to Hawkeye. So it's kind of establishing like its usual routine, but then it goes on for the entire episode. And how do you feel about this whole razzing Frank and just this whole setup for the episode?
Well, I didn't note so much down the razzing Frank part of this scene. I honestly don't even remember that much because so much comes later on with Frank that was kind of my focus. I called this the pre-chaos in our outline, and I agree with you that it's kind of like setting up this way about the episode where a typical watcher, someone who comes in every week and watches the episodes, are like, oh, okay, so it's starting out in the OR scene, what's going to happen, you know? And then it does kind of come from there. And I really loved the kind of conclusion to the part of the Ethiopian soldier when afterwards Hawkeye and Henry are talking outside, and we'll get to that in a minute. But the Ethiopian soldier is coming out of surgery and he thanks Hawkeye, we believe, in his native language. I wasn't able to find what he said, like the translation of it, but it was a very beautiful scene where he just takes Hawkeye's hand and he kisses it. And I thought that was just such an amazing, beautiful scene. And the acting for both actors was so great.
Yeah, it was really sweet. And Hawkeye says that, like, it's the nicest payment he's ever got. It's really nice to see. And what I like about all of this is that in any other episode, this scene in the OR would be basically the entirety of the OR for the episode, barring, like, maybe another section towards the end when things get serious again. But in this one, it just continues. Like, Hawkeye leaves the, OR, and it stays with him. We're getting, like, the immediate instead of, like, the wacky subplot or whatever. It's just OR. And I think that, like, that's a really kind of exciting change for the episode. Like, if you're watching this on TV in the 70s, unless you're using, like, TV Guide, if they had that at the time, I don't think you would know the name of the episode to know that it was OR. So having it be the entirety of the episode of it taking place in this one location, I imagine would be, like, much more of a surprise for someone watching it without knowing the title of the episode.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. So we had mentioned that Hawkeye and Henry were having this conversation, and I really loved this scene. They were talking about basically Henry's arthritis in his hands, because in the previous scene he was dropping a lot of stuff, and Hawkeye kind of asks him, like, hey, what's going on? So what did you think about this interaction between these two? This
was fantastic. I loved this so much, and this is what, like, made me really sit up and be like, okay, this is a different one, because I don't think that previously it's really been made established how good of a doctor Henry actually is. Like, he's never portrayed as a bad doctor the way, like, Frank is, but Henry is not a guy that is established like Hawkeye to be, like, a guy who really cares about everything he's doing in this OR situation. So have him talk very frankly to Hawkeye, saying, like, I like it here. I like operating on these people because it makes me feel like I'm doing something. And back in Bloomington, Illinois, it is very like by the book checkups was a really good kind of send off for Henry's character. And this has kind of helped with knowing the future of him. This entire conversation was like a lot more tragic and sad. And obviously, Hawkeye talking about how Henry has arthritis in his hands and like therefore his days as a surgeon are limited was so sad, but he like took it in stride. I thought it really rounded out Henry's character in a big way. I loved this interaction. It was so good.
Yeah, I thought that it kind of brought up this idea of how the war kind of affects people in a different way sometimes, especially like, you know, people who are experiencing it, people who are fighting in the war, of having this kind of like love-hate relationship with their time like serving in the war. Because, and this is me like kind of talking anecdotally because I, you know, don't have firsthand experience with this like at all, of course, but of how it kind of just becomes routine, you know, and the thought of kind of having to reintegrate back into stuff that's not military service, or Henry having to reintegrate into typical medicine when he is performing this like meatball surgery and saving patients' lives day after day after day. I think it's kind of a perspective that's not typically talked about, and also probably not typically talked about, especially during this period of time, of wanting to go home so bad, but then also wanting to stay also to almost like feel fulfilled and do this work and stuff like that. So I loved this scene. It was probably like top scene in the episode for me. Yeah, and also, like you said, the conversation that he and Hawkeye have when he says, you'll have to go home and die in your bed in Bloomington, that really got me. That was a real hard hitter for everyone who knows what's coming at the end of this season. It like hurt really bad.
I know. It was like toying with my heart. I want to know what they knew about the end of the season at this point in the show. If they were kind of planning a sort of send-off for various aspects of the show at this point. Maybe we can get into that a little later down the road in the season if we can find any information on that.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Just, again, this is such a well done kind of conclusion to like who Henry is. And obviously there is more Henry coming, but like this is a real like Henry defined moment in the way that we haven't had before. And it was like really nice to watch.
I did want to just say one more thing, or actually two more things. In the beginning of this scene, when Hawkeye is shaving with coffee, that is very funny to me. And also, we have to shout out the makeup people as well, because Henry literally looked like he had black eyes from the dark circles under his eyes in this scene. And you could tell he looked exhausted. He looked like on the verge of death.
Yes, they all look very worn out in this episode. But I want to circle back just real quick to what you're saying about war becoming routine. Obviously, again, like you said, I have no experience with it firsthand at all. But, you know, in media, I feel like that is typically shown from the soldier's point of view. And I just think it's really interesting that for this episode, we get it from the doctor's point of view and how, like, everybody's complex. Like, everybody is affected by this war, even if their role is very different than being on the front lines.
Yeah, for sure.
We're not being very funny, but neither's the episode. So I hope you enjoy this very dry conversation about how emotional this episode made us.
I think that we should talk about this next OR scene where, again, I'm very proud of the outline that we made for this episode with my headings. And this scene I called Chaos Sets In. Because this is when the shit kind of hits the fan a little bit. You can tell that they've been in the OR for like closer to 10 hours at this point, if we're going by like episode standard time. And I really liked how everything started to like kind of creep in and tension started to rise in this scene.
Yeah, I really liked how in the first scene, Radar's like, well, looking at the schedule, it doesn't look like we're going to make the movie tonight. Do you want to play the movie's audio over the speakers? And they do that in the next scene. Like, I was expecting that to just be like a one-off joke. But no, they play the Rita Hayworth movie via the speakers in the next scene. And I thought that was really funny. And I liked how Hawkeye kind of compliments Margaret and Frank by saying that they were the Rita Hayworth and her male co-star of the day. Like, to compare them to like a classic movie romance, I thought was like really nice for him to do. I haven't seen the movie that they were talking about.
I took that as more being him being sarcastic of just like, oh, hey, Frank and Margaret, who are, you know, Frank cheating on his spouse. Like, oh, you guys are the real love story here.
I suppose.
So that's how I took it.
This is why I need the laugh track. I need to know whether or not something's a joke.
I just really, what stood out to me in this scene, and we'll get into more of the like drama of this scene as well. But what stood out to me in this part that was really funny was that Frank, when they were playing the movie, Frank was like, hey, we should turn this movie off. It's so unprofessional. And I was like, what do you want to do, Frank? Just sit there or stand there and operate on people for hours on end in just complete silence? Like, I don't know if this was common back then, but I know now that it's pretty commonplace for surgeons doing 10 to 12 hour surgeries. They put on music because it just helps pass the time. So I was like, really, Frank? Are you just being a jerk? Like, what's wrong with you?
Obviously, Frank would not last in the modern day where everything has to have a podcast on in the background. Otherwise, you cannot do anything. You would hate this podcast. I just realized Frank would just absolutely loathe the fact that our show exists.
Frank hates fun. Frank is joyless, as we come to find out.
Yes, which we'll get into, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I like how things escalate throughout this episode, how it does go from this very standard kind of jokey OR scene to the next one being like, oh, we've been here a long time and it's starting to get on our nerves. Not that like things are going horribly wrong, but it's just like everybody's kind of off their groove because they've been doing this so long, and just how stressful it all is. I thought it was like done very well, and the various things that happen, going from Frank wanting it to be quiet to Frank almost removing a man's only kidney to the open heart surgery that like Hawkeye does very impromptu, was like a really good way of ratcheting up the tension throughout this one section of the episode.
I thought it was really interesting, the part where Frank is about to remove this guy's only kidney, and Hawkeye and Trapper kind of hear him make that comment offhand, and they're like, hey, go check on him, go check. Mm-hmm. And I thought that it was so interesting because it felt like this was something that they typically had to do. Like, hey, go check to make sure Frank's not about to kill this person. And lo and behold, he was. So I don't know, like, this episode was so good for me for so many reasons because it felt so grounded in the characters too. Yeah. We learn a lot about the characters and their roles and their positions there and their feelings and stuff like that in this episode through very kind of subtle ways. And this scene being one of them, of like, hey, they typically always have to check Frank's work to make sure that he's not fucking up.
Yes.
Or messing up, sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm going to keep the F word in because I like the explicit tag. If we ever get advertisers, they're going to have to deal with the fact that you swear. But, yeah, like you said, this is so grounded in the characters. This feels like a really final statement on a lot of these characters, or at least a very concise one. And, like, they often joke about how Frank is a bad surgeon and, like, will kill patients. Like, everybody, even Henry's like, oh, Frank's got a body count. Like, very dismissively. But we don't typically get to see him actually be a bad surgeon. Like, normally it is just kind of said, not shown. But in this one, with him nearly cutting out the kidney, and it is kind of justified of like, well, we're all in a rush and I didn't get a chance to like look at the x-rays. So it's not totally incompetence that gets him there. It is the stress of the situation. But the fact that, like you said, this is like a very routine thing for them of having to make sure that Frank's not committing horrible acts on the human body, it does more than other episodes justify why they are often so frustrated with Frank's kind of elitist attitude of He wants everything to be perfect and prim and proper, but also when he is left alone to his own devices, he will fail. And when you fail as a surgeon, there are catastrophic consequences for at least one person involved.
Yeah, I noted when I was watching the episode, maybe if Frank wasn't so worried about the literal MASH unit in the middle of a literal war being so unprofessional with them playing a movie over the speakers after 12 hours of surgery, maybe he would have remembered to check the x-ray. Frank, like full shade. I'm throwing full shade at Frank Burns right now. Although, okay, in his defense though, maybe he's one of those people who really needs to concentrate and needs complete silence. Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? But I'm going to blame Frank anyway.
I'll never understand those people. People who don't need to, like, split their brain into two by listening to a thing while they're, like, doing something else. I will never understand it. But from that, we get the kind of juxtaposition between Hawkeye and Frank as doctors, because Hawkeye's working on this patient and they don't have a pulse. I don't know if he fully dies on the table, but he's on his way there. And to revive him, Hawkeye performs open heart massage to, I guess, kickstart his vitals again. And it really does show that for all of Hawkeye's, like, goofy nature of, like, not taking too much of anything seriously, when it comes to the matter of, like, being a good doctor, he really is kind of putting Frank in his place. What do you think of this whole thing that happened with Hawkeye? Because this carries on throughout the episode.
So this was great. Like a perfectly placed moment in this scene with having it come right after Frank messing up because he didn't take the time to look at an x-ray versus Hawkeye ripping open this guy's chest to restart his heart. It was a really, really intense scene. And I know I said before that the arthritis scene was probably one of my favorite scenes, but this is also a great scene. I have too many in this episode.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a really intense scene, and I loved the acting from Alan Alda in this portion of it, because right after he is successful and restarts this kid's heart with his literal hand, he, like, needs to take a second, he has Henry finish up for him and, do the rest of the surgery, because he has to go kind of sit down and just be like, wow, I cannot believe that just happened. And Alan Alda really sold it with that performance. Like, I truly believed that this was actually happening, of just like, wow, I need a minute to process this whole thing.
Yeah. I really liked the actual surgery act of it too. It's one of those cases where, being a network television show in the 70s, they weren't allowed to show, like, any gore or anything, where a modern kind of medical drama would show you, like, the gory details of everything happening. They would use, like, prosthetics or whatever. But the fact that, like, the camera's locked off to behind this guy and we don't see anything that Hawkeye's actually doing, it's entirely on his face and his performance, I thought worked really well dramatically. And, like, really sold the stress of it and how kind of risky this was for him to be doing in the first place. This was just a really kind of cool moment for him in the middle of this episode. And like you said, his reaction to it is very strong. But I like how, as the episode goes on, this does kind of continue. This is not like a one-off thing. And just how it goes into the future scenes was really affecting. Like, Hawkeye's made me really sad in this one, how it kind of ends up for him, and that's entirely on Alan Alda's performance, I think.
I completely agree with you. Like, I felt the emotion in these scenes with this patient for sure, and I thought that the writing was just so brilliant in this episode as well, because right after Hawkeye, like, saves this guy, Trapper kind of diffuses the tension in the scene, and he is like, hey, I taught him everything he knows, haha. And it felt so in character for Trapper, you know what I mean? And Hawkeye too, of course, to, use any means necessary to save this patient, but for then Trapper to kind of like diffuse that tension because he knows that Hawkeye especially needs that at that point. And I thought it was really brilliant writing. And like I said before, like, the characters were really grounded in this episode. So I can't go. I can't go on more about it because I will just talk about this scene for the rest of the episode, honestly.
Yes, we're just gushing. I wish there was like a sticking point where I'm like, actually, this episode has one really bad point. I'm going to point it out because it'll make me sound more fair and impartial, like a good little critic should be, blah, blah, blah. But this episode, a start to finish, is one of the best things this show has done so far. And I say that a lot, like, in season 2, I think every other episode was like, this might be my favorite episode so far. But this is, like, pure good MASH. Like, this is what you want from the show. So, seeing all these characters so well defined and everything is so, like, structured really so well, and it's good emotions, and there isn't a laugh track, so it feels really different. Just watching this one, it's so much stronger than a lot of other half-hour sitcom shows. Like, imagine a show like this on today, and last week was like the goofiest nonsense you've ever seen, and this next week is one of the most dramatic things you've ever watched on TV. There isn't another thing quite like this, I think, on TV ever that has this much flexibility, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I can't imagine the tonal shift from episode to episode ever kind of happening nowadays. You know, everything feels a lot more cohesive nowadays. And there's like sad moments in sitcoms and heavy moments in sitcoms that are produced now, but not to the extent that they are in this episode and with this show, like you said, with having the goofy like body humor in the last episode and then to come into this one is just such like whiplash almost.
But it's like whiplash in a good way, where you're like, it has these two ends to it. So going from that, let's talk about maybe my favorite scene of the episode, when Frank and Trapper have this very serious heart-to-heart about like who Frank is. I thought this was the best Frank moment in the entire series. I really enjoyed what this did for Frank's character.
So before we actually go into that, I want to talk about the scene that was right before this a little bit, because in this scene, this is when I felt like the tensions were really starting to run high, because Hawkeye and Frank were kind of at each other a little bit more in this scene. They were, you know, yelling at each other and whatnot, and Henry has to get involved and kind of break them up and say, hey, Frank, like, take a break, take a couple minutes. And it felt really real, because I can imagine that the tensions would be seriously running really high after the volume of surgery that they're doing and the amount of hours that they're doing it in. And so I felt the setup for this conversation with Trapper and Frank was also really good. Like, I really enjoyed the conversation, but I thought that the setup made so much more sense of why the conversation happened as well.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you for bringing this scene up. I didn't forget about it, but I also was like, I also wanted to get to the good stuff, but you're right. This scene is really, really good too, because it's one of those scenes where you could tell that everybody is supposed to just be running on pure adrenaline at this point. Obviously, Frank and Hawkeye have always gone on to each other's throats, but this time, like, Frank is kind of done with the entire setup that they normally have. Like, their status quo, he's like, I am kind of done with this relationship. And it's one of those things where you could tell it's entirely because everyone's tired, which is really fun to watch. And you're right, it really does kind of bring it into this conversation with Trapper and Frank really, really well. And I really love this conversation that they have where Frank is kind of explaining himself in a way that he never has. He was like, I grew up in a very strict family. We weren't even allowed to hum during dinner. And like that really affected him and really humanized him. It took him from like the bumbling idiot who like nearly killed a guy because of his kidney, removing his kidney, to this kind of human man who, like, yes, has made mistakes, but also, like, you understand, like, where they're coming from, at least for me. I know that you have a personal hatred of Mr. Burns that I don't really, but how did you feel about this kind of heart-to-heart and humanizing of the Frank character?
Yeah, so I agree with you. It makes me feel bad for Frank sometimes. Like, anytime Frank really just kind of wants to be friends with Hawkeye and Trapper, I feel pretty bad for him. Like, he wants so bad to be liked. He wants so badly to be liked by Hawkeye and Trapper, but he's so insufferable that he just can't. But it kind of makes sense in this one scene of just like, oh, this is why he's insufferable and this is why he's joyless, because he grew up that way. It's like almost ingrained in him. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't excuse any of the other bad things that he does, of being racist at times and being like a terrible guy at times for no reason. But it kind of makes sense why he's so almost like tries to be by the book all the time, because he grew up in a very strict setting. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it kind of makes sense. But also I feel like Hawkeye and Trapper would be friends with him if he just let them be. You know what I mean? Let them cope with the war how they want. Let them drink. Let them womanize, whatever. And then, you know, just chill out, Frank. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This incarnation of Hawkeye and Trapper, like not speaking to the movie or maybe the book, but they are guys who like will leave you alone if you're not bothering them personally. So like I feel that it's only ever antagonizing Frank because he's kind of doing it to them too, or at least most of the time. Like Trapper is willing to sit down with Frank and have a conversation with him. Mm-hmm. And I really liked what Frank said with the bad blood doesn't run very deep, does it? Like asking if like sincerely they hate him. And I forget what Trapper's like response to that was. I'm pretty sure it wasn't like, no, we hate you.
Yeah, he does say, he's just like, no, it's not like real hate, but you're annoying, Frank. He says you're just a joyless person. And that's a pretty fair characterization of Frank. He's so annoying.
Yeah. No, this was one of my favorite scenes in the entire episode. In a episode of nothing but great scenes, I really liked how they took the time to be like, all right, Frank is a person. Let's explore that for a minute. And obviously, the Henry stuff is very emotional for outside reasons, and everything kind of around this episode is so good. But anytime they take the time to explore characters like Frank and Margaret, who are such like one-dimensional stick in the muds depending on the episode, I just get a real kick out of. I like how they treat everybody like complicated people, even if in some episodes they don't seem like they're particularly complicated.
I think any scene that really makes you feel for the character that you're supposed to hate, I really like. I like the complexity. Even though Frank is not like a complex character, I like the complexity of him in this scene. And it was very endearing to see. And I really thought it was cute when he was asking Trapper and saying, hey, okay, does that mean that we can be friends now? And Trapper's like, yeah, sure, okay, I just want to go to sleep. And then that travels into the next scene in the OR when Hawkeye is saying something and Frank is trying to be amicable with Hawkeye because he wants to be his friend now. It was very funny. It was very cute continuity.
He's such a little puppy dog, Frank. He'll act like he's got bite, but if you show him a little bit of kindness, he's like, oh well, I'm gonna try for a moment if I could be a cool guy, but unfortunately he's just not inherently a cool guy.
So like I said, right after this scene comes the next OR scene, and this is the one where Sydney arrives, and I love any episode with Alan Arbus. It heightens any episode for me. So what did you think of his just arrival? It was kind of sudden and surprising.
When Sydney shows up, first of all, I'm not as familiar with this character as you are, so I didn't immediately jump to that's Sydney. But as the second I did put together, like, that's him, I was like, oh, that's fun. It's very interesting to have him be in this setting because we've only ever seen him kind of outside of OR, like during break moments. So to have him kind of roped into performing surgery, I thought was like really fun and a good way to kind of bring some levity back into the episode for a little bit. Because he has a great conversation with Klinger about how, like, come on, Doc, you can give me a psych. Come on, man. Look at me, I'm wearing a dress. And he's just like, listen, man, there's so many people wearing dresses like that. You gotta step up your game, basically. Which is so funny. That felt like a really good send-off to Klinger, too, if this was, like, the finale of the show. That felt like a really good final Klinger moment. It's so funny that this is just, like, Season 3, Episode 4. Like, this feels so definitive to me. I want to know what the writing process was of, like, oh, we just happened to have this amazing script for this one episode.
Yeah, I know. To go back to Sydney's arrival, too, I always love when anytime Sydney shows up, Klinger just like kind of jumps on him immediately. Mm-hmm. He's like, hey, Doc, this new thing I'm doing, crazy enough to get out of the army? It's just always so funny. And I love also that Sydney is always there, apparently, to play poker. He's like, oh, okay, I guess we're not playing our poker game. I'll see you next Thursday. And they're like, whoa, doctor. Time for you to scrub up and use your medical skills. And I loved Alan Arbus in this scene because, like Alan Alda in the rest of the, like, really emotional bits of the show, Alan Arbus, like, really sold it for me of being terrified to have to perform surgery after, you know, not going to med school for a really long time. He's like, hey, med school was a long time ago. I don't know if I can do this, but okay, I guess. It was very fun.
I really liked how he was like, I haven't washed my hands since I became a doctor. Which is so disgusting. Obviously, it's a joke, but, like, the image of that is like, oh, no, buddy, you have to wash your hands. Everything about this is really fun, but also you're right, like, his terror is still, like, pretty legit. Like, it feels pretty honest. And I like how they have him do this, and then, you know, he eventually does decide to leave, and he's like, all right, ladies and gentlemen, take my advice. Pull down your pants and slip on the ice, and, like, just pieces out.
We have a long time until we get to this, but this kind of comes back into play in the in the series finale. So it's really funny that you say that this feels like the end of the show because there's a callback to this in the last episode of the series. That. So that's very fun. But this is also the scene before Sydney leaves. He is assisting Hawkeye in surgery, and this is when Radar tells Hawkeye that the patient that he performed the open heart massage on didn't make it. And like I said, great acting from Alan Alda here of just, like, needing to take a second and tearing up and being really upset. And I loved that Sydney was the one who kind of talked him through this as well, knowing that Hawkeye didn't really need to be coddled in this moment, but he was still kind of comforting him. Yeah. And I think that this made the scene with the Ethiopian soldier even more impactful. Like, Hawkeye was so happy that he was able to save this guy. And then, but no matter what, no matter how many patients he actually saves, he is still gonna be terribly upset when he loses a patient. And yeah, I thought that this was a really well-rounded, like, kind of completion of Hawkeye being a doctor in this whole episode, but kind of ending on this scene. It was very impactful to me.
Yeah, this is the closest kind of callback we have to the speech Henry gives in Sometimes You Hear the Bullet, when he says something along the lines of, like, the reality is that you cannot save everyone. And it was just it was nice to have that kind of through line. Like, yeah, that is the reality of it. Sometimes you're going to win, sometimes you're going to lose. And it's okay to be affected by it. Like, they never, like, Hawkeye, get your head in the game. But they are like, well, you're needed right now. Like, he even says, like, oh, maybe if I went to post-op with him. And I think Trapper's like, well, you couldn't have done that. We need you here. How they're able to balance the reality of being a doctor in this high-stress scenario in such a funny, silly show is something that, like, I really love. I love the fact that this episode exists. I'm definitely going to probably rewatch this episode a lot. This is one that I will return to.
Yeah, and just a little bit more about this scene too. I really thought that, like, I can't commend the writers enough because having this parallel reaction when Hawkeye needs to like take a second when he finds out that he lost the patient to when he had to take a second after he saved him was just so brilliantly put together. And I loved the writing in this episode, but specifically in this scene, they were really like kind of strutting their stuff. I loved it.
Yeah, very cohesive, very structurally sound. This is one where you could tell they were not writing by the seat of their pants. Like other episodes in this season, there were so many endings that felt so abrupt, that felt like they literally wrote up to the ending and didn't really know where to go. This one felt like they had a full idea, a full picture of the episode instead of doing these more abrupt things. This one was so cohesive and had such a strong arc for everyone involved that if this wasn't Emmy nominated, I don't know what was. You know what I'm saying?
I also wanted to talk about the scene right after this too. It's after Hawkeye finds out he loses the patient, Sydney leaves, and then Henry calls Hawkeye over and he basically asks him to help him decide whether they should save this one soldier who is there's no chance that he's going to make it if they decide to operate on him. And I know that I've said 2 separate times that I had different favorite scenes, but this scene for sure was actually my favorite because I had a very like visceral response to this scene. It was very impactful, and I almost got choked up at this scene where they were having this discussion of we could spend 8 hours working on this one patient and then he's going to die anyway. Or we could save 8 other people. And I was like, shit, that is probably something that these doctors, these real doctors in the real MASH units had to decide all the time. And that to me just recalls back in the 30th anniversary special. I'm sure that Larry Gelbart had to have written this with the real MASH unit in mind. It was just such a great scene.
Yeah, okay. So I completely forgot that the scene existed. And I know that's going to make you laugh and everything, but I think that speaks to how dense this episode was. That like this very pivotal scene where it's very emotional and, like you said, very realistic to the real life circumstances of having to decide life and death for various people. That this enormous scene, I was like, oh yeah, this happened. This episode's incredible. This episode has so much going on.
With how short the scene was, I was surprised at how impactful I found it as a viewer, because it was super heavy for such a quick 1, 2, 3 part of like an ending scene.
Yeah.
And yeah, I thought that, like you said, this episode is so jam-packed with so many things like that it is like blink and you'll miss it kind of thing, but it is so hard-hitting for me.
And it's important, too. It really does kind of bring the episode to a conclusion because them having to make this very difficult decision, it's basically the classic like trolley problem of you can save one person or you can save a lot of people. It's like that could be the conflict of an entire episode. And they just put that at the end because how much was already going on that in their exhausted state, they had to make this very difficult decision, and just really kind of shows it never ends for them, that like they're always going to have this. Was like a really good final kind of note to end on of like real drama before we kind of move a little bit more into a slightly funny, slightly like levied ending of the episode.
Yeah, I agree. And I wanted to talk about this one, I guess this final scene in the OR before the episode kind of concludes, of something setting on fire. Somehow like a pipe or whatever sets on fire.
Well, okay. So first of all, Trapper, I think, smells smoke, or maybe Frank. And then they bring in hamburgers and coffee. So it's like, hey, we're making it through. We're done with the supplies issues that we've been having. Because also, they've been having supply issues. It's been going on so long that, like, they had to get Henry's thread from his, like, tent to use as, like, stitches. So there's a lot of, like, escalating stuff that we have not talked about. like the fact that Radar, like, gave 2 rounds of blood accidentally. Some people stole Radar's blood in this episode.
Yeah,
it's just such a...
I was gonna bring that up of like, wow, so Radar got his blood stolen too. That's really interesting. Okay, I guess this is just a theme for this show.
But yeah, so they bring in the hamburgers and it's like, yay, we're basically done. This is like the happy note. And then something just catches on fire. It's like a pipe. We don't really know what it is. And they're all like genuinely freaking out because it's this terrifying thing to have, especially in a room with like oxygen and everything where things could catch on fire and possibly explode. Not great. And Trapper just like squirts it with water from like a syringe, I think. It was a wild kind of ending.
Yeah, and it was like pretty justified chaos too of, hey, there's a fire, you know, we have open bodies here that could cause like massive problems for all of these patients that they're working on. And like you said, things could blow up, whatever. And then Margaret yells at Trapper. She's like, you're an idiot. You should not have done that to put that fire out, because what if there was alcohol in the syringe that you used to douse the fire? You could have like killed us all basically, or just started a much bigger fire. And I was also mad at Trapper because you are never supposed to put water on any kind of like electrical or oil-based fire. So just for our listeners out there, don't follow Trapper's lead. But I also thought the final portion of this scene was also so good because, you know, Trapper's getting yelled at by Margaret, and then he goes, "Hey everyone, the war, remember?" And then they all kind of have to go back to doing what they're doing. Like, they literally don't have time to worry about a stupid thing that could have happened when they have to tend to patients who are going to die if they don't. I loved that whole wrap up of that portion of the scene.
Yes. It's easy to be like, well, Margaret's calling him out, and Margaret's usually wrong about things when she calls him out. But like, yeah, he shouldn't have done that. But also, it is a good demonstration of like, how you do need to act quickly in a difficult situation. So, like, yeah, he shouldn't have done that, but, like, it's one of those classic things of, well, it worked out, so leave me alone. And then they go back to work, and it ends, the final scene is, like, literally the PA being like, basically, it doesn't end. The episode ends, but, like, their OR adventure doesn't.
So yeah, so let's unpack that scene a little bit more, because I thought it was really a powerful way to end this amazing episode, because the PA system was talking about how this new general was taking over all the UN forces fighting in Korea. And then while the PA is going on, there's this scene of Trapper kind of wheeling Hawkeye out after he passed out in the OR. He was just so tired. And the final quote from the announcement is, "And that's the news. No one's succeeding us at all." And then it just fades to black. And I thought it was so powerful because it was this great commentary of bureaucracy and the war and all these guys making decisions about the war and who's in command, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, the doctors are still like right in the same spot that they're always in. They're dealing with the same stuff every day, no matter who's in charge. And I thought that that was just such a great point to end the episode on.
Like I was trying to say, it never ends. It's just gonna keep going. Sorry I phrased that like an absolute idiot. We've just been talking a long time. But yes, you're right. The PA noting that like everybody's kind of changed command doesn't matter to them. They're just gonna be here tomorrow stitching up more people was pretty good like war commentary. This episode does end on a really strong note, and it was kind of like an eerie note too. When the MASH music starts and it's all like the screenshots of the different parts of the episode, it was so tonally different than like the end of the episode. It was very jarring.
Yeah, because it faded to black and there was a good like 3 seconds of just like black screen before the ending credits. And I liked that. I thought it made you kind of like sit with it for a second. And you're right, it was very like tonally different than the rest of the show. But I did like how it ended because you did have to sit there and think about that for a second. And I don't know, I thought that it was like a perfect ending to this show.
Yeah, this could have been a really great series finale. Obviously, MASH has the most famous series finale of all time. It's the most watched thing ever. But if this was the final episode, if they ended after 3 seasons, this would have been a really great way to end the show. But now I'm excited to see where it goes from here, because this was a really revitalizing episode for me. This made me excited to see more of the show again. Not that I was having a bad time, but there is a big difference between watching the super goofy ones with the dead bodies and the general who does a song and dance away, to watching these, like, the ones where you can talk about it for over an hour and still have more to say. So I'm excited to see MASH march on. And from that, do you have any favorite lines from this episode?
Yes. So this wasn't a huge comedy episode, but there were some pretty good lines that I found. So right in the beginning, in the first OR scene, when Henry is talking to Klinger, he goes, "Klinger, take that dress off at once." And Hawkeye goes, "Not in front of Trapper. He's a married man."
Yes, I love that. We didn't even mention the guy who's like serially cheating on his wife and wants to send a letter to her. And Trapper's like, "When did you find the time to get wounded?" That was amazing. There's a lot of good Trapper moments in this one. I have to shout out this little moment that we didn't mention when Klinger is told to go get more blood, and like a vampire, he goes off and says, "I want to get more blood or I'll die," and just like walks away. Amazing. One of the greatest Klinger moments.
It was such a great moment. I loved that one. I really liked it wasn't a line per se, but when Frank and Hawkeye were kind of fighting in the OR and Hawkeye makes some kind of like sexual joke and Frank calls him a smut merchant, I was like, oh my gosh.
There's so much in it. There's so much in this one.
Give me smut merchant on a shirt. I love that.
We could print that up. We'll get that to you. There's so much in this episode. Even though this episode didn't feel particularly funny, there's still so many good little moments. Like, in the beginning, Trapper is stitching up a guy. He's like, "Oh, I think we have a repeat offender. This guy has your stitches, Hawkeye." And Hawkeye's like, "Well, if you could see the stitches, they're not mine." And somebody like in the background's like, "Hawkeye needs a little bit of humble pie," or something like that. Just that nice little earned ego from Hawkeye I thought was really delightful.
Yeah, I liked that too. That was really funny. So I do have some trivia about this episode as well. So we had talked extensively about this Ethiopian soldier, and this was actually kind of a tribute to the Kagnu battalions that fought in the Korean War. So the Kagnu battalions were several units from the Ethiopian military that served in the Korean War to aid the United Nations and the United States and South Korean forces. At the outbreak of the war, the United Nations had asked its members for military assistance, and the Emperor of Ethiopia at the time sent the Imperial Bodyguard Division of the Ethiopian military, which was previously tasked with guarding the royal household and maintaining internal security. The Kagnu Battalion served mainly alongside the 7th Infantry Division of the United States Army, and their patrol of the Battle of Porkchop Hill in 1953 was of distinct note for them. So, and then as like a recognition for the Kagnu Battalion's services, the U.S. military named a military base located in Africa after them called the Kagnu Station. So I didn't know anything about this, and I thought this was a really amazing kind of tribute to these other people who fought in the Korean War that you don't typically hear about. So I do have some resources as well of if you want to any of our listeners want to read up on this, because this is a piece of history that I had no idea about.
No, that's very interesting. When they bring up this Ethiopian soldier, they do make an offhanded joke of like, "Oh, he must have really got lost on his way here." Or, something along those lines of like how much he doesn't fit in with what they typically see. But I always like stuff like that. Like in the movie 1917, there's a lot about like in the background of like, I think Indian soldiers who were in World War I, just kind of people you don't typically see depicted in war movie / TV show narratives. I always find it interesting when the creators of it want to include explicitly how diverse the actual group of people were in the war.
Yeah, I think that because we're American and we go to American schools and whatnot, it is a very like American-centric based version of history. So I always like to find out these things of how, the world is just bigger than, Europe and America. So I always think it's really cool.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned also that this episode deserved an Emmy, and I do have some good news for you.
Oh, yay!
So Gene Reynolds won an Emmy for his directing of this episode, and Larry Gelbart and Lawrence Marks, who wrote the episode, won the Writers Guild Award for their writing in this episode. So credit where credit is due.
Well deserved. The same duo who wrote the flag finale of last season also wrote this episode. Ain't that wild? Ain't that fun how much range they actually have?
Yeah, you better put some respect on Larry Gelbart's name, because last week you were like, Larry Gelbart is a weird writer.
Hey, man. Why
but
you
it's true,
call
like
me out like that?
No, like but you had said it's really funny how he does these things of these zany episodes with like hiding a dead body, and then the next episode he writes this like incredible episode. So I can't say that you're wrong, but don't disrespect Larry Gelbart, Ethan.
I will never again. I have nothing but respect for Mr. Larry Gelbart. He is such an interesting man and has such an interesting body of work.
So I think that we barely need to do martini ratings for this episode, because
1 out of 10, worst one I've ever seen.
I think that our listeners can just kind of guess by the context of this episode and how long it is that we both give this 5 out of 5.
Yes, of course. It would be insane if I was like, you know what, 4.5.
That said, too, usually I give 5 out of 5s to episodes that utilize all of the characters. And I felt like it utilized all the characters really well. Even like Klinger, Sydney, Father Mulcahy was in it for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know. I just thought it was all everything you'd want in a MASH episode and more.
Mm-hmm. I mean, even Father Mulcahy helps Klinger when his heel breaks and he walks down the hallway with one heel. I thought that was pretty amazing stunt work for Mr. Klinger right there.
That was good. That was good.
So, just to wrap up, we'd like to give thanks to Jacob for offering our technical consultant, Melissa, Vanessa's sister, for cover art, and, of course, our listeners. Links to our music, social media, and contact for the show are in the description, as always, and join us next week for Season 3, Episode 6, Springtime. But until then, check the x-rays before cutting out a kidney. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everyone.